Welcome to the second part of week 4, where we deal with the history of the writings of the kings. And so we ended off speaking all the way through until the Babylonian exile. It was during that exile that the people gathered together and wrote all of the history down of all of Israel. And now we stand and we look at what happens after that. And so after the Babylonians had taken the Israelites or the Judeans into exile, the Persians started to rise to power. The Persians rose to power and they ended up taking over Babylon, and they kind of painted themselves as this picture of the liberators of Babylon. So they were the ones who came in and set people free from the tyranny of the Babylonians. So what they did is, when the Persian king first took over, he allowed the Israelites to return to Israel, or the Judeans to return to Judah. And so a group of people, those who wanted to, all left Babylon and they went through to Jerusalem. They started to resettle, and a couple of years later, a second group left. And this group had a specific task. I think it was Nehemiah and Zechariah. No, not Nehemiah. It was Zechariah and Haggai. Their role was to assist in this. And they had to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so the history continues that during this Persian period, there's this rebuilding of the temple, and then a third group go back, and they were with Ezra and Nehemiah, and their role was to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They've been given permission, and so they start rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. It's in this time period that the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are written, and they are probably the most fascinating books in the sense that they were written in the moment. It seems like they are telling the story as it happens. It doesn't focus on the people, Ezra and Nehemiah, rather it focuses on the actual story. And so Ezra and Nehemiah tell us the story of the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the walls. And it sounds like it must have been amazing and incredible, but you can imagine that it had its challenges of its own. The challenges that it had was that, as you can imagine, you have a group of people that have been away from Jerusalem for 40 years, and they were the rich and the wealthy, and the people left behind were the poor, the outcasts. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was a poor person, or if I was part of the vulnerable and all the rich were taken away for 40 years, I would have moved into their houses, occupied their land, carried on with life, and that's exactly what happened. So you can imagine there's this conflict, because now suddenly we have people that come back and they're going, but this is my land, my nation, I'm in charge. And there's other people that are going, but we've been running this our way for 40 years. And so there's this conflict, there's this constant clash as they're trying to rebuild Jerusalem. On top of that, there's a group of people in Jerusalem that they've settled, they've married foreigners, they've kind of done their own thing. And Ezra and Nehemiah come back and they start saying, oh, but you shouldn't have married other wives, you shouldn't have married foreign wives. And they start saying that if you've married a foreign wife, you are not an actual Jew. You have been defiled. And so the whole book of Ezra and Nehemiah takes us on this journey of the rebuilding, of the resettling into Jerusalem, of dealing with this conflict and all of those things. The book of Ruth is a fascinating book because nobody can really date it. It's one of those timeless books. And some people believe that it might have been written in that time period because Ruth seems to counter this idea of foreign wives. And maybe it wasn't written there, but it was certainly used in that time period to say that even David's grandmother, his great-great-grandmother, was actually a foreigner. And so how dare they say that foreign wives make them less Jewish? And so that's the history of Ezra and Nehemiah, possibly Ruth, in that time period. But the Persians, they started getting a bit greedy, and they started trying to take over the Greek city-states as well that were spread out. And as they tried to do that, they got weaker and weaker, and then Alexander the Great enters onto the stage. And he has the most incredible military strategy. And he unites all of the different Greek and Macedonian people together. And he marches and he takes over everything. He went as far as modern day Pakistan. He took over everything. Unfortunately, Alexander the Great only had 10 years to enjoy it, and then he died of some fever. And when he died, because he was so young, because it was at the beginning of his rule and his reign, he hadn't actually ascribed a successor. And so two generals, I can't really pronounce the name, it's Ptolemies and like Seleucids, they decide to take over, and they fight between them. And so this Greek kingdom, this massive kingdom that Alexander the Great has built up, splits into two. You have the one general and the other general, the Ptolemies general and the Seleucids and their group. And they divide the nation, this big Greek state that has been conquered, this Greek nation, and they divide it between them. And then they constantly fight for possession. The one general, he originally, and all of the details are in the booklet, but he originally had control of Jerusalem and the Judeans, and they lived in peace. He respected them, he allowed them to do their own thing. Obviously they paid taxes, but he respected them. When eventually the Seleucids took over, things changed for the Judeans. He tried to force them to take over. He tried to force them to worship his God. At the same time, they were under pressure because the Romans had started rising up and taking over and were demanding taxes from the Greeks, and so the Greeks would get their taxes from the Jews. And you can imagine that the Jews now, they're being controlled religiously, politically, financially, and they're starting to, it's like a pressure pot. And it's like a cooker pressure, that like a pressure cooker pressure. It's like a pressure cooker. And what's happening is all of this pressure on them from a financial, religious, political perspective is on them. And eventually, a guy called Mattathias, he is asked, he's a priest, and he is asked to make a sacrifice to a foreign god, and he refuses point blank. And obviously this is going to cause some kind of uprising, and the Greeks are now going to punish him. And so another Jew steps forward to do the sacrifice on his behalf, and he kills him. This Mattathias, he had 5 sons, and they run into the mountains and to start a guerrilla warfare that a lot of the Jews joined them. And their guerrilla warfare actually worked, and they gained control of Jerusalem for a few years. And in that time, though, there was this definite split in the Jews during this Hellenistic, this Greek period. You see, the Greeks came in and tried to educate people with their culture and their language and their buildings, and they seemed so sophisticated. And so the wealthy, the rich, the well-off Jews, they fell very easily for the Greek way of life. And they gave up on their Jewish heritage. And the poor, they clung to it with all of their might because it's all that they had. And you can imagine those empowering the Jews, they ended up putting more pressure on the poor. It's kind of this like, you know, the Romans are now putting pressure on the Greeks, and so the Greeks go and say, well, now we'll put pressure on the Jews. And so the Jews turn around and say, okay, well, now we'll put pressure on the Jews that are beneath us. And so we'll increase rent, we'll increase taxes, we'll increase all of those, and the poor got poorer and poorer, and the rich got richer and richer. Sounds a lot like South Africa today, where the poor is getting poorer and poorer, and the rich get richer and richer. And when that happens, eventually there has to be some form of uprising. And that's what happens with the Jews. At the same time, because the Jews don't have an established kingdom, because they're in control, or they're being controlled by the Greeks and eventually the Romans, the people that take on the government, the leadership of the Jews, are actually the priests. And so the temple becomes the front line of the nation. It becomes the ruling party. And so the priests rise in power. And some people didn't like that because they believed you shouldn't mix religion and politics. But the priests were even in charge of taking the taxes. They were in charge of distributing the taxes to the Greeks and eventually the Romans. And that's the period just before Jesus enters the scene. And it was in that time period, this ruling of the Greeks, that it seems the Chronicles, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, and possibly even Esther, I'll speak about Esther just now, were written. And they were written with 3 main things in mind. It was the temple, it was religious festivals or religious ways of life, and it was worship of God. It was the priestly way of life. And so that's why when we look at the Chronicles history, it takes us through the same journey of like Kings and Samuel, but it tells it with a little bit of a different perspective as they write it down. Esther, although Esther was set in the Persian period, it seems like Esther could possibly have been written in this Greek period. And the reason they say that is because the festival of Purim, which is based on the story of Esther, was only ever recorded from this time period. Before this time period, there was no indication of this festival of Purim. And so we look at this book of Esther, and Esther is a study all on its own, and one day I believe we'll study it, hopefully. But Esther is one book that doesn't mention God at all. And perhaps that's something you'd like to look into, or read the book of Esther and find out why. Why does the book of Esther not mention God at all? And that's a discussion for another day. And so now we've taken ourselves on this journey. We have been all the way from Genesis right through. We've looked at the Israelite history of how they were first wanderers in the desert, or slaves, then wanderers in the desert. Then they lived as tribes and clans and families. Then they had a kingdom which was united and strong. Then there was division, and there was southern and northern kingdom. Then they were conquered, first the northern kingdom, then the southern kingdom. Then they were able to get back and rebuild. But even though they were able to rebuild, they were never again a nation on its own with a king like David. And so this is the story of the historical writings. Next week we will be looking at the poetic writings, and that is a completely different kettle of fish, the wisdom writings. It's a completely different way of looking at scripture. And so I truly hope that you would join us next week. Thank you.